In this lesson, we talk about limiting factors in photosynthesis and also the effects of photosynthesis in Earth's history. Now, in photosynthesis, we need light to provide the initial input of energy. We need carbon dioxide for raw materials. And we also need a moderate temperature so that enzymes can function, not too cold and not too hot. And any one of these three things can limit the rate of photosynthesis if it's not optimal. So, for example, if I have a graph here of light intensity on the x-axis and rate of photosynthesis on the y-axis. If I were to increase the light intensity, I might see an increase in the rate of photosynthesis. And that rate of photosynthesis might be measured, for example, by how much oxygen is being produced. So I increase the light intensity and I see an increase in the rate. And that might continue for a while, and then it will plateau. So at this plateau, further increases in light intensity, brighter and brighter lights, are not increasing the rate of photosynthesis. However, if I increase the carbon dioxide concentration, I might see a different plateau like this. So this is low carbon dioxide concentration, and this is high carbon dioxide concentration. What we see with the higher carbon dioxide concentration is that I can get a higher rate of photosynthesis. That means that in this example, carbon dioxide was the limiting factor because an increase in carbon dioxide allowed me to get a higher rate of photosynthesis. Light intensity was not the limiting factor because as I increased the light intensity, I was no longer getting any further increases in photosynthesis. So one of these things, light, carbon dioxide, or temperature, will be the limiting factor at any one particular time. And in this experiment, this is an example of carbon dioxide being the limiting factor. And you could design other experiments to work out which is the limiting factor in other circumstances. And just a brief note that, as I mentioned before, temperature is different than light and carbon dioxide. More light and more carbon dioxide is going to help photosynthesis, but higher temperature isn't always going to help photosynthesis. You want a temperature that's not too cold, because if it's too cold, there's not enough molecular movement for the reactions, but you want one that's not too hot, because too hot and you'll denature the enzymes that are important for photosynthesis. So that's a quick look at limiting factors in photosynthesis. Let's change gears now and talk briefly about the important role of photosynthesis in Earth's history. Oxygen gas, of course, is needed for cellular respiration, and so is needed for animals to evolve and survive. But oxygen gas itself is a product of life. Oxygen is formed as a waste product in photosynthesis. It doesn't occur naturally in the atmosphere of planets, and so oxygen gas in the atmosphere of planets is something that astronomers look for as a sign of life when they're looking for life on other planets. Now, cyanobacteria, which are photosynthesizing bacteria, were the first photosynthetic organisms. And before this, there was no oxygen gas in the atmosphere. In contrast, there's about 21% oxygen today in the atmosphere. And even after cyanobacteria evolved, there was not a sudden burst of oxygen at 21% like there is today. It was much lower, around 1 or 2% of Earth's atmosphere for a long time, and that's because the oxygen was being taken up by the ocean. The ocean was a sink, and in fact what was happening was the oxygen was reacting with iron in the ocean, and that's seen in banded iron formations that formed around 2.5 billion years ago. So the oxygen was reacting with iron and effectively rusting out the oceans, and a lot of oxygen was consumed in that way, and it was only when that iron was used up that then oxygen was no longer reacting with iron, because the iron was used up, and started to build up in the atmosphere. And that was called the Great Oxygenation Event, or also called the Great Oxidation Event, and happened about 2.4 to 2.1 billion years ago. So after the iron was used up, that now oxygen increased a lot in the atmosphere. And I should mention that this is only one hypothesis. There is disagreement about some of this. Then that buildup of oxygen in the atmosphere allowed animals to evolve. Now, I'll also mention that atmospheric methane was in much higher concentration in earlier Earth history, but with the increase of oxygen, it was oxidized to carbon dioxide. Now, both methane and carbon dioxide are greenhouse gases, so they trap long wave radiation and warm the Earth, but methane is a much more potent greenhouse gas, and so the conversion of methane to carbon dioxide decreased the greenhouse effect, the temperature dropped, and in fact a massive glaciation completely covered the Earth in ice. This is sometimes called the snowball Earth. And also more formally known as the Huronian glaciation. So this is just another example of the profound effect that photosynthesis has had on Earth's history. Photosynthesis produced the oxygen that allowed the evolution of aerobic organisms, and also at one point plunged the whole Earth into a global ice age.